Coming up, nothing, no journalism at all. I've had more engaging conversations, more challenging exchanges at a Wendy's drive-thru speaker. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Let's talk for a few minutes about something that we haven't covered for several episodes. Let's talk about the Defund the Police effort that's being pushed from the left and by many in the Democrat Party. Now, we've all sort of assumed that the push was coming from two groups of people: diehard left-wing Democrats and Democrats who were too afraid of their left wing to say no. And we've kind of assumed that it was all part and parcel of trying to agitate the Democrat Party base to ensure turnout on Election Day. Now, I and many other commentators as well have already talked about the Democrat move in that respect being a mistake. But as you know, I try to discuss angles, motivations, political strategies that you may not have heard of and may not have been discussed on the major media outlets. And one of those angles exists with regard to this particular issue. What if the reason why many Democrats are supporting the Defund the Police effort isn't because of, or solely because of, the reasons I set out? What if their motivation is something much more ordinary, much more typical of a political party? Trust me, this won't make it any more wise. It's still a bad move. And given the way it threatens the safety of the public these elected officials are supposed to protect, it doesn't make it any more excusable. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about one of the motivations for the Defund the Police effort being the fact that police unions and firefighter unions are the only government employee unions that are linked more with Republicans than Democrats. Think about that. Local Democrat politicians may be pushing to defund the police in part because police unions often don't support Democrats. But there's more. The Defund the Police push has been explained by some as not really a push to defund, but rather a push to reform, including reforming by having social workers rather than police respond to many calls, including domestic disturbance calls. Well, what party do you think government employees unions to which social workers belong tend to support? You guessed it, the Democrat Party. So as you watch riots and looting and people being threatened and accosted in restaurants and other public places, and you watch it on the internet, on Fox News, and to a dramatically lesser extent on other networks, and you're thinking, I can't believe local Democrats have been pushed so hard by their left wing that they're trying to defund the police when their constituents need them most, just consider for a moment that it might not just be the push from the left. Local Democrats might be engaging in a cynical, ethically corrupt power play, putting their constituents' lives and property at risk for the sake of increasing the power of labor unions, which tend to support Democrats, and punishing those which tend not to. And that cynical power play would deliver two results which those Democrats may be counting on. The first, of course, is increasing the number of government employees of unions linked to the Democrat Party. And the second would be to deliver a message to police unions that this is what happens when you choose to support Republicans rather than Democrats. What's the cure for that kind of cynical power play that risks the lives and property of the citizens of those communities? It's to deliver a message to Democrats at the ballot box that you lose when you play these games with our lives, our families, and our property. Do I think that's going to happen? In the bluest of blue cities, it's doubtful. But if they're just a little bit less blue, just maybe, and that would be a sight to see. Next topic. Miami nice. I've lived in South Florida for over 3 decades, and the political rule has been pretty steady throughout that period. The rule is that Florida statewide elections, including presidential elections, break down as follows. South Florida contains massive numbers of Democrats, so the key for Democrats in South Florida is turnout. Much of the rest of the state, particularly North Florida, votes Republican. But the populations of Miami-Dade County, Broward County, and Palm Beach County are so huge that Democrat turnout in just those 3 South Florida counties can overcome the Republican presence in the rest of the state. And then the key to it all is the I-4 corridor, the population clustered along Interstate 4 from Orlando to Tampa in the center of the state. If the rest of the state behaves in typical fashion, what happens along the I-4 corridor determines who wins. So does that mean that candidates can and do ignore the rest of the state and focus simply on the I-4 corridor? No, not at all. And if they do, they risk losing badly. Because of the massive population in South Florida, even though it includes one of the highest concentrations of Democrats outside of New York City, it also includes large numbers of Republicans and even more independents. Because the bottom line is there are more than 6 million people in those 3 counties. If the Democrat voters in those 3 counties are not energized for the Democrat candidate, that candidate is doomed. If the independent voters in those 3 counties break hard in favor of the Republican candidate, the Democrat candidate is doomed. If Republicans in those 3 counties are energized for the Republican candidate, and independents in those 3 counties break moderately for the Republican, and the Republican does reasonably well in the rest of the state, the Republican has a good shot at winning the state. And in that scenario, if the Republican wins the I-4 corridor, he or she will win the state. So, why am I going into this level of detail? Well, it's no secret that Florida is one of the most critical swing states. President Trump can win without Florida, but he couldn't afford to lose a single additional state that he won last time if he loses Florida. And the assumption that South Florida is the biggest hurdle for a Republican seeking to win the state is incorrect. It's not only a strength for Democrats, it's also a weakness. Because every slip-up, every deterioration from the Democrats' position of strength in these 3 counties is amplified by their populations, to the point that the single slip-up can guarantee a loss by the Democrats statewide. If they perform well, it's extremely hard for Republicans to overcome those numbers. But if the Democrat screws up at all in South Florida, if the Democrat is weak, they can lose badly. A reduced turnout or independents swaying to the Republicans will be almost impossible to overcome. So what's the latest news about Joe Biden and Donald Trump in South Florida? Well, as I said, the population of those 3 counties is huge. It's over 6 million. The biggest of those counties is Miami-Dade County with a population of over 2.7 million. In 2016, Donald Trump won the state of Florida over Hillary Clinton by 113,000 votes. Keep that number in mind as I tell you what's happening in Miami-Dade County among Hispanics. The Miami Herald reports that the result of their poll, jointly conducted with Ben Dixon and Amundi International, shows that Joe Biden is leading Donald Trump 55% to 38% in Miami-Dade County. So if you support Donald Trump, you're probably thinking that's concerning. But remember what I told you. South Florida is both a strength and a weakness for the Democrats. There are huge numbers of Democrats here, but the party has to run up big leads to offset the Republicans in the rest of the state. So is 55 to 38% a big lead? That's 17 points after all. Well, in 2016, Donald Trump lost to Hillary Clinton in Miami-Dade County by 30%. 30 points, 290,000 votes. She did 13 points better than Joe Biden is doing per the Miami Herald poll in the most populous county in the state, loaded with Democrats, and she still lost to Donald Trump by 113,000 votes statewide. I can guarantee you that the first Biden campaign operative who read those poll results had to change his shorts. So assuming a turnout equal to 2016, Joe Biden is 125,000 votes behind where Hillary Clinton was in Miami-Dade County in 2016. If the numbers for the rest of the state mimic 2016, President Trump would win the state by approximately 238,000 votes, or more than twice his margin of victory in 2016. Now, you've no doubt noticed that that assessment is filled with a number of assumptions, including that turnout in Miami-Dade County will mimic that of 2016, increase the overall numbers, and because of the high numbers of Democrats in the county, a 17% margin would be better now than a 17% margin back then. But, of course, there's no way it would be as good for Democrats as the 30% margin that Hillary had back then. So the bottom line is, if that poll is accurate, the Democrats have a serious problem in Miami-Dade County. Well, what's the source of the problem? The Herald addressed the issue in an article by David Smiley on September 8 entitled, "Biden is struggling to win Miami Latinos, new poll finds. Will it cost him Florida?" What the Herald reveals is that the poll found that Trump actually leads Biden 47% to 46% among Hispanics in Miami-Dade County, based in large part on the fact that Trump leads Biden among Cuban Americans in the county by 38%. Wow. If that poll is right, does it virtually guarantee President Trump a win in Florida? No, but it leaves Joe Biden with one enormous hill to climb. Next topic. The Keystone. Ask yourself which was the most shocking, most dramatic, most critical state win for Donald Trump in 2016. You could say Florida. It has 29 electoral votes. But even though commentators were saying Hillary would cruise to victory, if you told them in advance that she would lose Florida, they wouldn't be flabbergasted. They'd have figured her other state wins would still allow her to coast to victory. But if you told them in advance that she'll lose Wisconsin's 10 electoral votes, they would be absolutely shocked. If you told them she'd lose Michigan's 16 electoral votes, they would in fact be flabbergasted. But if you told them in advance that she would lose Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes, they would be absolutely floored, and they would suspect that loss would not come alone, that losing Pennsylvania would signal that other states were in play, including Michigan and Wisconsin, both of which Donald Trump ended up winning, and Minnesota, where he came very close. And his campaign has said they think they could have won in Minnesota if they'd crammed in another rally before the election in that location. Pennsylvania then and now, in both its official nickname and the political reality, is the Keystone. If Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, it will put him not just 20 electoral votes closer to the 270 needed to win, but it will signal once again that he's in position to win potentially Michigan, Wisconsin, and even Minnesota. And incidentally, if he wins Pennsylvania, it will also mean that he'll win Iowa handily and virtually cakewalk through Ohio. So what's happening in Pennsylvania? Well, Politico reported on the issue on September 10 in an article by Holly Otterbein entitled, "I Want to Be in the Trump Party. GOP Rides Voter Registration Surge in Key State." The article reveals that since 2016, the number of registered Republican voters in Pennsylvania has increased by nearly 7 times the amount by which registered Democrat voters has increased. Specifically, 198,000 registered Republican voters added compared to 29,000 registered Democrat voters added. So what's going on? Well, the article is filled with stories of increased Republican support in counties that voted for Barack Obama in 2012, then voted for Donald Trump in 2016, including voters actually stating, quote, "I want to be in the Trump party," close quote. The critical question is how many of those voters were voting Republican in general elections all along, even though they weren't registered Republicans. If they were, it's really not a net gain. If they weren't, this is huge. But as the article points out, there are still more Democrats in the state than Republicans, about 750,000 more in fact. But that differential was greater in 2016, and Donald Trump still won. Democrats have gone from 49% of the electorate down to 47%, and Republicans have climbed from 38% up to 39%. In combination, that's a 3-point swing. The margin of victory in Pennsylvania for Donald Trump in 2016 was only 0.71%. Don't be shocked if he wins this time by 3% or more. Next topic. CNN, the joke that sometimes gets serious. I've criticized CNN multiple times in multiple episodes of this podcast, but the one time I found them actually engaging in legitimate journalism, I made sure to point it out. Sometimes I don't bother to address the latest absurdity from CNN because, frankly, they're so common it's become a joke. If there's one thing that's common among virtually every media outlet these days, it's asking Joe Biden absurdly easy questions, or asking somewhat probing questions and then failing to follow up, failing to challenge evasive or false responses, and certainly failing to aggressively pursue him the way purported journalists attack President Trump. So I could go on to a number of different press outlets and reporters pointing out their absurd softball questions to the former vice president. But let's keep this segment short and just focus briefly on CNN. CNN's Brooke Baldwin asked Joe Biden 4 questions in an interview this week. And before we get to the questions themselves, compare for a moment the extent to which President Trump sits down for long interviews, even long interviews with clearly adverse journalists, compared to Joe Biden. Sure, Trump gets interviewed by supportive commentators like Sean Hannity, but he also gets interviewed by journalists from CBS and Axios HBO as well. So Brooke Baldwin asked Joe Biden 4 questions. What were they? 1. Should all 50 states issue stay-at-home orders? 2. Do you believe the president is intentionally misleading Americans to paint a rosier picture? 3. Do you think President Trump is responsible for the deaths of Americans? And 4. As a politician, your strength is in traveling around the country and connecting with people, looking them in the eye, a hug, a handshake, especially in those crucial months before the election. And you can't do any of that right now. Mr. Vice President, does that worry you? Those were the questions, every one a softball, especially given that there was no follow-up to any of Joe Biden's responses. No response from Brooke Baldwin challenging any of Biden's answer. No attempt to push him off his talking points. No attempt to challenge the simple messages by explaining complex problems related to stay-at-home orders, for example. Nothing. No journalism at all. I've had more engaging conversations, more challenging exchanges at a Wendy's drive-thru speaker. Look at the second and third questions. They're literally just setups for him to blast his opponent. And finally, the final question, it's a joke. If you wanted to challenge him but focus on that sort of question, ask him why it seems that his strength would be in a direct one-on-one contact with voters, but he doesn't seem capable of drawing a large enough crowd where he delivers a message to large groups of people so that it doesn't have to be a handshake and looking individuals in the eye. His small crowds predate COVID. Sure, they're smaller now, but ask him whether he's using COVID as a way to explain tiny crowds when he's never shown any capability to attract large ones. Ask him why is that? Why have you never seemed to resonate with large gatherings the way your opponent has? And that's only if you wanted to focus on those technical campaigning questions. I, for one, don't think they should. They should be focusing on the serious stuff, like his history of making claims that he did or didn't take certain positions and his claims conflict with the demonstrated facts. In light of the anniversary of 9/11, one example would be to ask him why he claimed on video that he opposed the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, only to later claim that he actually supported it when his prior statements became a political liability for his coming presidential campaign. So are we ever going to see serious questioning of Joe Biden from CNN? Well, yes. Brooke Baldwin interviewed Joe Biden on Tuesday. Jake Tapper interviewed him on Thursday. In the interim, there was a significant amount of criticism of the absurdly softball-laden Tuesday interview. That may have given Jake Tapper some encouragement to act like an actual journalist. And he did. Did he treat Joe Biden as aggressively or disdainfully as he would have President Trump? I doubt it. But when I see actual journalisming going on at CNN, it's pleasantly shocking enough that I have to applaud it. One of the things that Tapper pressed Biden on is the fact that he and President Obama had a chance to renegotiate NAFTA and had promised to do so during the campaign, but never did, whereas President Trump did in fact renegotiate it. Biden claimed that a Republican Congress stopped them from doing so, and Tapper failed to remember and bring up that the Democrats controlled Congress with a filibuster-proof Senate majority in the early years of President Obama's term. So Biden's defense was simply false. But Tapper did continue to press Biden, saying about Trump, quote, "He renegotiated NAFTA and you didn't, is the point," close quote. He also managed to pull out of Biden an acknowledgement that Trump's replacement for NAFTA is in fact an improvement over NAFTA. So what does that tell me? It reinforces what I've said before on this podcast. What has happened to CNN is a shame. They have actual journalists on their staff. They're broader than Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo. If they actually chose to be a journalistic enterprise rather than to function largely as the propaganda wing of the Democrat Party, the quality of the political discussion in this country would be dramatically improved. So, are we going to see that from CNN? Short of occasional outbreaks of journalism like we recently saw from Jake Tapper, I'm not betting on it. But you can bet on quality weekly commentary from Political Spirits. I'll be back next week with another episode. Please join me and tell your friends to do so as well. And like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.